Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today is a follow-up video to a video that I made yesterday, which I'll link down in the description, regarding this book, Inside the Atheist Mind by Anthony DeStefano. I've been reading this. I actually picked it up at the thrift store, and it turned out to be a pretty good find. And I think he makes some key points in this book that I wanted to share with you guys because I thought that they were really valuable and wanted to bring them out. In today's video, I want to talk about the big lie. The big lie as a concept and the big lie that is often told by atheists about Christianity and about religion and faith. And when I say atheists, I don't mean all atheists. Mostly here I'm talking about those militant, keyboard warrior, angry, angsty atheists who just love to get on and rage about how much they hate Christianity, kind of in the same vein as their leaders like Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. So let's talk about this concept of the big lie. Now, this is not necessarily something that is specific to the atheism versus theism debate or anything like that. Anthony DeStefano in his book says that this originated, or at least became popular, with, guess who? Adolf Hitler, when he was spewing his propaganda all across Germany and trying to convince people of things that weren't technically true. This concept of the big lie was mentioned in Mein Kampf, his book. And it's the idea that if you're going to lie to people and you want to convince them of a lie, you need to lie big. Don't lie small. Small lies are not as believable, and people are often very skeptical when they hear small lies. The reason is because they also tell small lies. So it kind of trips their censor of maybe this is not exactly the full truth. But the idea of the big lie is that if you frame it right and you can get people to repeat it, you can actually lie big, or go home. And if you lie to people in a big way, they're often less suspicious. And the reason is because this is not something that they would do. They would not tell an obvious, big, obnoxious lie to somebody else. And so when a government or someone in authority does it to them, they start to think and question themselves and say, well, maybe there is some truth to that. Certainly they wouldn't, lie in such an extraordinary way. Maybe they're right about this. DeStefano writes in his book, big, blatant lies can often seem more credible if presented in the proper way. The reason is that good people have trouble believing anyone would even attempt to tell them that enormous and obvious of an untruth. So it's in a lot of ways kind of a psychological trick. Now, to tell the big lie well, first of all, you need a big, huge, colossal lie. And then DeStefano says, number two, you need a constant repetition of that lie by the masses. And then number three, you need a suppression of the truth through a climate of fear or a climate of shame. Now, Hitler went on to use this to convince all of his people that the Jews were really the reason for all of the problems in society. It was all their fault. All them and, the other people that he wanted to get rid of, they were the issue, and everything could be solved if they were just taken out of the way. Now, this was a huge, big untruth, but many people bought into it, obviously. That's not the big lie that I want to talk about today, though. The big lie that is coming from many atheists is one that you hear repeated and trumpeted all over, atheist social media and all in the comment section of Christian videos, and that is that Christianity, that religion, faith in God, is the cause of the majority of bloodshed and war and violence and suffering that's existed throughout history. There are many atheists like the ones that I mentioned in the beginning of this video, Dawkins or Harris or Hitchens, that just act like religion is the worst disease that has ever happened to mankind. And if religion and faith, and especially Christianity, was just taken out of the picture, the world would be such a better place, and there would not be so much war and violence anymore, because it's what instigates it all. So this is their big lie, and like point number two on how to make this successful, they then need to get the masses, their other, kind of militant atheist friends, to repeat this over and over and over again, and they have been successful in that in a lot of ways. So they bring up, they cite things like the Crusades, for example. Wow, how horrible were the Crusades? Or the Inquisition, talk about all the people that died in the Inquisition because of those evil Christians. And they say, look, if religion wasn't here, the world would be so much better. It is the biggest problem that exists in the human experience. And DeStefano writes this about this lie. He says, it's a lie, a big blatant, bold-faced lie. Religion is not the cause of most of the wars that have taken place. It is not the cause of most of the murders that have taken place. It is not the cause of most of the bloodshed that has taken place. To even suggest such a ridiculous thing is to display an ignorance of history tantamount to imbecility. The idea that Christianity is the primary driver of bloodshed and war and suffering in the world is just, to suggest that is just to be ignorant of history. If you look back into the pages of history, what are actually the biggest drivers of war and violence and perhaps crime and suffering as a result of some of those things? Well, the first one DeStefano suggests is economic gain, right, which is secular. People wanting money, wanting some kind of financial benefit, they go to war to acquire other people's stuff and take other people's stuff. He says the second one is territorial gain. These are the two things that have started most of the wars in human history. One king wants to expand his kingdom, wants to take over some territory that somebody else has. We're seeing this even in the world today in the 21st century. And so he says these two things, which are secular things, are what really drives war and violence. And that the pages of history tell this story again and again and again, not that religion is the cause of these things. Now, there is an important distinction to make. Sometimes kings or governments would try to justify themselves in going to war for economic gain or territorial gain by invoking the name of God. You know, maybe England would say, oh, those Catholics down in France, you know, how dare they be Catholic? The king really just kind of wanted their territory and their land and their titles and their money and their natural resources, but he invokes the name of God to wage a war against France or something like that. That is not a religious war. That's not a Christian-driven war. The real drivers of that are the two things DeStefano mentions: territorial economic gain. Just because somebody invokes the name of God and puts this under some kind of religious heading doesn't mean that that's the actual motivation. And I think that's important to point out when you look back through history. It wasn't that these men were just so zealous in their faith that they started wars. It was actually that they were using that to really cover their true greed and intentions. Now, there are actually some historians who have done work to document all the wars, the known wars throughout history, and why they likely started. There's a book by Phillips and Axelrod, a 3-volume set called The Encyclopedia of Wars. And in this encyclopedia, 1,763 wars are documented that waged between 8,000 BC and 2,000 BC. Pretty much all of known documented human history. And Axelrod and Phillips say that only 123 of these 1,763, only 123 can be classified as truly religious in nature. And that's not just Christian wars, that also includes Islamic wars and other religions. So if you take out the other religions and you just deal with the Christian wars, what percentage of wars were actually waged because of the Christian faith? These guys suggest that it's around 3.23% of all the wars in human history. So 3%, basically, 3.25%. A very far cry from the claims of many of these new atheists who say that, wow, Christianity is just, plaguing our world with war and suffering and violence. No, actually what we're seeing here is that it's other things, it's secular things primarily that drive these wars, not issues of faith and religion and doctrine. Now, arguably, one of the reasons that these new atheists repeat this lie constantly and promote it so heavily is because the facts of modern history especially are really against the atheist position. And when we look at the casualties and the violence and the murder that has been brought about by an atheistic worldview in just the last 100 years, we find out that, actually, a secular, purely secular, atheist, naturalistic mindset is by far and away the biggest driver of violence and abuse of other human beings and suffering than anything that's been coming out of the religious world and across the centuries, essentially. So the Crusades, which is often quoted by atheists, those were 1,000 years ago. The Inquisition, 500 years ago. Okay, so let's just take a look at the last 100 years. We don't even need to go back that far. We could. Let's take a look at the last 100 years and see where atheist naturalistic thought has taken us, and the people who actually took it to its logical extremes, where they took society. I think you're going to find out that if there's any case to be made, it's that this kind of thinking is actually the plague on society. The atheist, non-believing view is actually what plagues society, far more than the theist position. Okay, so let's go back about 100 years to a guy named Joseph Stalin. You probably read about him in your history books. So Stalin was a staunch atheist, and he ascribed to that set of views and that way of thinking. He led the Soviet Union for about 25 years, 1927 to 1953. Now, the total number of all of the deaths connected directly or indirectly to Stalin's policies and his persecution of people, it's hard to estimate, but I would say most people estimate it to be somewhere between like 30 million to 60 million people who were killed, and who knows how many suffered and had violence inflicted on them, but 30 to 60 million who died as a result of this atheist policy, his ways of thinking, and him carrying these views to their extremes. You know, a lot of atheists, they say, oh, we can't be associated with guys like Stalin or guys like Hitler, things like that. But, you know, really, a lot of atheists are just not realizing that these are men who took their views to the extremes, and that modern atheists usually just aren't comfortable with that. They don't have an argument against it. They can't morally object to it. They just aren't comfortable with it. So they try to disassociate themselves from these people and say, oh, these guys were extremists. Like, well, maybe they were extremists, but really they're just playing out your way of thinking to a greater degree than you're willing to do. So Stalin, 30 to 60 million. And then you have Hitler. Obviously in Germany in the 1940s. Sometimes you'll hear people try to associate Hitler with Christianity, and this just isn't true at all. He was not a Christian. He seems like he didn't even believe in God. I don't know that he ever stated that he was an atheist, but he was certainly not a Christian or a supporter of Christianity. Of course, he used some propaganda to pander to Christians during his time in office. But there are some writings of his that were released in 1953. This is on page 40 of Distophanes' book. And Hitler made some very clear statements of his hatred of Christianity. He says, the heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity. He says, National Socialism and religion cannot exist together. The reason why the ancient world was so pure, light, and serene was that it knew nothing of the two great scourges, the pox and Christianity. I think most of us know from school that there were 6 to 7 million Jews who were killed by Hitler, and that doesn't even include those who were handicapped or those who he deemed to be not fit for his superior race and his society. And you have to think that Hitler's bad policies in a large part brought about World War II and the violence and the war and the suffering that came along with that. And there were approximately 20 million people that were killed in that conflict as a indirect consequence of Hitler's thinking and his values or lack thereof. Basically out of the fact that Hitler made himself God and tried to stand in the place of God. And this is what can happen when you make that mistake. Now, these men are probably the most infamous of those in the 21st century, at least in the Western world, but you also have men like Mao Zedong in China, who was directly, indirectly responsible for 40 to 60 million deaths of largely his own people. And there are other dictators all around the world who abused their authority and thought more of themselves than they should have because they didn't believe in God and they really didn't have any moral compass guiding them. So we say all that to say, just look at the last 100 years. These are people who the atheists desperately want to separate themselves from and distinguish themselves from. But again, these are just men who carried out the atheist thinking to a further degree than most modern atheists are willing to take it. But that doesn't mean that they were wrong in the application of their worldview. And this is interestingly, and this is something DeStefano mentions in his book as well, is that in the 19th century, atheists back then actually recognized that men like Hitler or Stalin or Mao could crop up and that atheists justified them in their actions. And they were willing to acknowledge that this could be the consequence of an atheist worldview. Most modern atheists, even the militant ones, won't accept that. They won't accept, what the older atheists could and would. Probably because it makes atheism sound like not that great of a way to lead your world. Okay, so we don't just want to point out all the problems with the atheists and ignore ours, or put our examples forward and just ignore the examples that the atheists put forward about Christianity. So let's talk about the Crusades. Crusades happened between 1095 and 1272, about 200 years. So this was not a short span of time, about 2 centuries, where these 9 crusades took place. Now, this is 1,000 years ago. Historical records certainly are not as good as like what we have in the 19th or 20th century. So it's debated how many people actually died in the Crusades. But even secular historians will say it was probably somewhere around 5 million. I've seen numbers slightly higher. Most of the numbers I've seen are lower, around 3 million. But let's go with a nice, even number that most people will be satisfied with and say 5 million people died in the Crusades. And then you have the Inquisition. This was a political persecution by the state in the name of religion. It happened 500 to 600 years ago, and the Inquisition has been greatly exaggerated, DeStefano argues, by people who want to use it as a way to bash mostly the Catholic Church and Christians in general. He says most figures that, again, the history is somewhat dim as to details, but he says somewhere below 150,000 people were charged with crimes, and only about 3,000 of those people were actually executed for the crimes that they supposedly committed. So 3,000 deaths total. There's an argument that many people died of malnutrition and prisons and things like that, up to 100,000. So let's say 100,000 people died in the Inquisition. Now, let's do some math. These crusades and inquisitions that are so often quoted as indicators of the horrible worldview that Christians promote, right? These that are put forward as the example that the world's greatest evils and the greatest source of suffering is Christianity, they amount to approximately, on a somewhat high side, let's say 6 million. It's lower than the numbers I gave earlier. Or higher than the numbers I gave earlier. But let's say 6 million. 6 million people. Now you compare that to, let's give a somewhat low number of those individuals who were motivated by atheist thought into committing crimes against sometimes their own people, Stalin, Mao, Hitler. That's about 100 million on the low side. 100 million to 6 million. So with the Christian examples, we're stretching back 1,000 years to get these examples. It's just the 21st century that we have to look at in the case of the atheist-driven examples, the godless examples. 100 million to 6 million. It's not even close. The idea that Christianity is the driver of the most suffering and violence and terrible things in our world is just a big lie. It doesn't matter how many followers or disciples of these atheists that they get to parrot this claim about the destructiveness of Christianity. It just isn't historically true. Don't let them pull the psychological trick of the big lie on you, because that is what they're doing. And I wanted to share DeStefano's insights on this because I think it's great that he actually goes and gets some of the numbers, which is something you don't hear often. The way that the atheists present it, you would think 1 billion people died in the Crusades, and the Inquisition finished off another 100 million, and there were basically no humans left on the earth after those two events. It's just not, simply not the case. It's a misrepresentation of the facts. And when we look at the statistics in comparison to what the atheist worldview has done, it's quite contrasty in realizing and bringing our minds to a realization of which one is actually leading to more war, more bloodshed, more violence, more suffering.